In 2023, Estonia's liberal parties had a tremendously successful election, winning power and decisively defeating the far right. But how does Estonian politics work, and what does liberalism mean in Estonia? This week's episode is another episode in our Liberalism Around the World series, and we're focusing on liberalism in Estonia. We're joined by Tarmo Juristo, the founder of SALK, one of Estonia's most important liberal political organizations. Tarmo and I talk about how Estonian political parties are organized, why liberals have been so successful in Estonia, the most important issues for Estonian liberals today, and how the spectre of Russia influences Estonia's politics. If you like the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe, recommend it to your friends. If you really like the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Either one of these will get you access to our bonus episodes, our community Slack, Sticker of the Month Club, and more. Support the podcast today, and thanks for listening. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me in this episode is Tarmo Juristo. Tarmo, welcome to the show.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
It is always such a treat for me to do these episodes, and I enjoy them so much. Learning about other countries and learning how politics and policy works in places that are not America. It's always really fun for me, and I'm excited to get things started here. I think a lot of our listeners really enjoy hearing about how the world works in places that they're not familiar with. So to kick things off, I guess, for people who are not familiar with Estonia, can you describe a little bit how Estonian politics works, just on a basic level, for people who don't know much about it?
Well, as you're asking this question, I'm kind of smirking on my side, because the short answer would be that at the moment Estonian politics is working really, really badly. We've been having the filibuster in the parliament for a second week. Everything has ground to standstill. I don't know if you have a family-friendly podcast, so otherwise I'd like to use some expletives here, but the things are not going well in Estonian politics at the moment. However, stepping back and then taking a little bit of a broader view is that as most people would probably, I would imagine, knows, Estonia is one of the member states of the European Union. So we've been there now for quite a while. It's one of the liberal democracies in the European Union, and we have as is normal, as is usual in Europe, we have a multi-party system. Currently, there's 6 parties in the parliament. We just recently had a election at the beginning of March, where we had, I'm glad to say, we had a liberal landslide. So this is something that we can probably talk a little more about today. But the end result, the government was just recently sworn in and started a rather sweeping package of policy changes, reforms, and the opposition clearly did not like this, and basically just ground the parliament to halt.
One of the things that you mentioned there, and something I was very excited about when it happened, was that there was a liberal landslide. There was the 2023 elections in Estonia, and as you said, it's a multi-party democracy. Many different parties are in the legislature, but the liberal parties all seemed to have really successful elections. They all kind of overperformed, and they were able to form the government. But that raises the question that I always love to ask: what does liberal mean in Estonia? Do people actually use the word liberal? And if they do, how do they define it? Because, in many different places of the world, Europe versus America versus South America versus Asia, liberal can imply very different things. So how do Estonians understand liberalism?
Yeah, this is a theoretical here that can be split for quite a while. But the let's say I guess this is pretty much a consensus view that the big sort of watershed in the way how people understand the concept of liberal is between the American and the let's say the European view, where in the American view, and I'm just giving a rough generalization here, is that the liberal tends to be used as kind of a synonym for left, and in Europe there's a little bit of different tradition that the American use has been seeping in Europe. So, however, I still think that the distinction remains a valid and useful one, is that the American view tries to or tends to conflate the left and liberal, which is not necessarily the case in Europe, where the left-right distinction remains separate, and then there's a liberal-conservative one, which as I've been saying before, as I said before, has been inching closer, but still remains separate from this. So you could easily have a right-wing liberal or right-wing conservatives and so on and so forth, because of the multi-party system helps to maintain that distinction for longer. So the coming to this, how being liberal is understood in Estonia, then again, I should say that this is a generalization. There are different people placing different accents or different nuances to the same term, but this refers to a more of a social attitudes. And not so much of a state's role in the society, or a state's role in redistribution of wealth and so on and so forth. So this is tends to be a separate issue, as I said before.
How does the history of Estonia, obviously having been in kind of the orbit of the USSR, how does that influence kind of liberalism in Estonia, where obviously Estonia has a history of socialism, and we can talk about, that was not necessarily a voluntary history, but how does that history of kind of having been part of the socialist empire that existed for many, many decades, many generations, how has that influenced liberal thought in today's Estonia?
Well, with this, I think it would be useful to just for a moment to zoom out for a second and give a little bit of a broader context. So in that sense, Estonia is in today's Europe also part of the Central Eastern European bloc, which in which basically all the countries had a this, as you referred, not entirely voluntary and rather unhappy relationship with the Soviet Union to different degrees. Estonia was a member of Soviet, or actually we were occupied by Russia, incorporated into the Soviet Union. Let's say like Poles or Hungarians or Czechs had it a little better, so they were in the influence or sphere of influence of Moscow after the Second World War, but the basic premise is actually rather similar. So Slavoj Zizek has written about this in the past and said that if once the Berlin Wall fell, then the Central Eastern Europe embraced the liberal West. And this is, of course, something that, Francis Fukuyama, who's been the guest in your podcast before, has been writing extensively in the past and saying that what exactly happened at that time. But if I just shortly summarize the point that Slavoj Zizek was trying to make, was that the people in the Central Eastern Europe knew really clearly what they wanted to get rid of. So in that sense, this is like, in Isaiah Berlin's terms, what they were looking for was the negative freedom, the freedom from something. However, once they once they gained that, so once they became free and independent sovereign states, then they discovered that what they got together with this, they got something else that they didn't necessarily bargain for at the time when when they just yearned to be free from the influence of the Soviet Union, from the influence of Moscow and so on, from socialism. That was something that a lot of people defined their opinion or had a kind of a reference point that this is something you want to get free from. And this is now leads to a first observation. So one of the things that has been prevalent in the Estonian politics, and this is again not just in Estonia, this is has been case throughout the region, that the socialism has a bit of a bad name, and this is of course to a great misery for the Social Democrats in this region, is that they have been in this slightly difficult terrain where they need to navigate the difficult waters between the traditional leftist political ideology of social democracy and the socialist sort of heritage of the 20th century, which of course was a very different kind of socialism from the one that is implied in the name of social democracy. But that is one of the things where the social, or the, let's say, the communist past of the Soviet Union has been clearly influencing the politics and the perceptions of what is left and right, what is the role of socialism, what is the role of solidarity in the society. So it's of course, the history has influence on all the countries to a different degrees, because everyone has had their different trajectory throughout the Soviet times and after this. But what I just wanted to underline is that to a certain degree, the Central Eastern European countries and former Soviet republics, republics in name, of course, share certain similar backgrounds, where they're coming from a similar system with similar kind of troubles and issues, and this is something that is still visible now, although Estonia has been a free country ever since 1991.
I think the point about the heritage of social democrats is really interesting, because in America, we don't have to deal with that as much, at least today. There are people who could describe themselves as social democrats in America, and there are people who could describe themselves as social liberals, but they're both within the Democratic Party. So in a political sense, they don't really have to talk about, well, one of them comes from socialism and the other one comes from liberalism. They're all just Democrats. And whereas, as you said, in Estonia, that would be two different parties with two very different intellectual histories. And it's just something that, we don't have to deal with as much.
Well, in a way you do. You also have, people in the U.S. Congress who make this distinction between being social democrats and democratic socialists. So I'm of course referring to Bernie Sanders and AOC here. So I do agree that this is a different kind of world, and of course one of the I think defining differences between the European and American politics, if you look at the left-right scale, then most of your Democrats, even the most leftist ones, would be considered at best center-right in European terms.
It's interesting you say that, because I feel like that gets said a lot, but I'm not sure that it's always accurate. I think it's accurate if you look at a small handful of issues, perhaps. But in terms of things like immigration or other issues that are, salient as well, I'm not sure that the whole America's left is center right and Europe thing holds up very well.
Well, this now we're getting back exactly that distinction between left and liberal that we said before. So when you talk about issues like immigration, then this is something which in European terms wouldn't be understood as a left-right issue rather than liberal-conservative issue. Now, if you talk about, for instance, financing healthcare, then that would be a left-right issue. And the U.S. healthcare system is, far off the charts in European terms on the left-right scale. So I think this is something which, there's a very real and clear danger of us talking about in using different vocabulary describing the political reality in these comparing American and European systems because some of those basic terms mean different things in these different places.
That's true. I find that always to be a little bit overplayed. I think Europeans sometimes can underestimate how, far to the left Bernie Sanders actually is. For instance, he, in his most recent presidential campaign in 2020, he proposed an 8% wealth tax, which would be something like 6 times higher than the current highest wealth tax anywhere in the world. He is genuinely very far economically to the left. So I just don't think we should underplay that. He would be quite far to the left, even in most European politics, I believe.
Well, yeah, but then again, you're comparing a little bit apples and oranges. You're comparing the campaign promise of a leftist politician to an existing tax regime in Europe. So if you look around in Europe, then you'd find people in many places in Europe who are proposing much more than 8% wealth taxes or stuff like this. It's just that those, by virtue of us having pretty much everywhere on the continent, you would have to have end up with the coalition governments, and then these extreme campaign promises have a very little chance of actually materializing in policies. This is a argument that is probably not worth having to a greater degree, and it's just that I want you to make that underline that point and say that in general these things mean a little bit different things. And of course, Bernie Sanders is not your average leftist American politician either.
Completely fair. I think it's a fair point. The next thing I'd love to talk about is, so Estonia's liberals have had some success, but then also you mentioned there's been some frustration very recently. Just in the last couple of weeks, the parliament has become gridlocked, and it seems like there's the opposition party may not be operating in good faith. But I think the bigger question here is, what problems do liberals see in Estonian society? What are the biggest issues that politics needs to solve in Estonia if you are a liberal? If you have a liberal belief system, what do you identify as these are the things that Estonia must act on right now?
Well, in general, just as you said, of course, we have been on a pretty positive track ever since 1991, as far as the liberal worldview is concerned. But I think this is again one of those moments where it could be useful to zoom out for a moment and take a broader look at what's been happening in the European politics, not just in Estonia, because we're just one of the small countries in Europe, and then we're going along with all the big trends of what's been happening in the continent's politics, in the EU politics. And one of the defining things, of course, again, this is not in no way limited to Europe, and as an American, you know it all too well, is the rise of the populist politics and the rise of the far right, which is definitely not a European phenomenon. So this has been going on globally, and in most of the European countries, I can actually really think of only one clear outlier, which is Lithuania. In all the other countries, we have seen over the last, let's say, about a decade, in all those countries, the populist far-right parties have been cropping up. In many cases, they have been making it to the parliament in lesser degree, but also in a very big number of cases, they have been making it to the government. And that was also the case in Estonia. So after the 2019 election, our far-right party, EKRE, was able to become one of the members of the three-party coalition. They were not the prime minister party, but they were one of the three members of coalition. They had the equal seat. The government seats were distributed equally, so 1/3 to all the every member of the coalition. So we had 2 years where the far right was in full-fledged member of the government, and that was something which I think was a sort of a wake-up call for a lot of people in Estonia who were not that interested in politics before, who then suddenly, figured out, like using the famous quote by Barack Obama, that elections indeed do have consequences. And so that is something that sort of in a way laid tracks for the 2023 election and to the Liberal landslide that we said before. But now coming to kind of from the different angles, so what are those big issues for Liberal-minded people that are still outstanding, that would need to get solved? So one of those is actually a bill that was proposed to the Parliament, or as insofar as the filibuster allows it. So it was passed from the government and issued to the Parliament. Was the legalization of same-sex marriages, and that is something that Estonia has been. Estonia in 2014 was the first former Soviet country that legalized the same-sex civil partnerships. And that was a really divisive issue. That was a true culture war in Estonia back in 2014. So now 9 years later, it's kind of a war again on that issue. So this is not the only reason why there's a gridlock in the parliament. So this is definitely, it is an important issue for our far right, who's trying to block it. But there are tax changes. And some other local policy issues that are hotly contested between the coalition and opposition. But I just want to single out and say that the marriage equality or the same-sex marriage is clearly one of those kind of it's a sign of the times, so to say, in Estonia. So if in US this trend has been going on for quite a while. So I think it was something like in 2009 or 2010 when the situation flipped in the United States, where the supporters of the same-sex marriage outnumbered those who were opposing it. So we are a little bit behind the curve here, but trying to catch up.
One thing that it strikes me it would be good to talk about is how Estonian politics is actually organized, because we're throwing out terms like the Estonian liberal parties and the Estonian far right and things like that, but that doesn't always mean the same thing in every country. And oftentimes, different countries have politics that are arranged around something that's completely different than the left-right axis. One of my favorite examples is we did this episode with Taiwan and talked about liberalism in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, left versus right is almost not a thing. The parties are very much defined by their attitude towards China. There's kind of the more integrated with China party versus the oppositional to China party. And so I guess in Estonia, would you describe kind of the political axis, the way that the parties organize themselves? Is that pretty much the same as the normal European left versus right? Or is there another important axis there that we also have to think about when we understand political parties in Estonia?
I think you're absolutely right that this is a really dangerous thing to try and generalize even across the European countries, because oftentimes the parties' names can be real misnomers. So there can be a liberal party that names itself or calls itself a liberal party that is not so liberal at all. For instance, again, in Lithuanian conservative parties, actually, if you look at their policies, then they are pretty liberal. Coming to Estonia, exactly the point that you made about Taiwan. So clearly, Taiwan has the China relationship looms large. So it is a defining feature of their domestic politics. In Estonia, we do a lot of database stuff in our organization, and if you run factor analysis on the people's political opinions, then there are three major factors emerge. And if you interpret them and try to look behind, what they reflect, then the most salient distinction appears to be exactly the liberal conservative one. So this is kind of it covers all the culture wars, like hate speech, like the same-sex marriages, things like these. But it's also very visible in the division of opinions over immigration, for instance. So that is something which Estonia has again kind of a very difficult past with immigration, and I'll get to that in a moment, because actually this is the second big defining axis of Estonian politics, is the fact that we do have about 20% of population as a ethnic minority Russians. So this is again the Soviet heritage. So and that has impact to the immigration issue that I said before. That a big part of the society, and this is it's also important to notice that the Russian-speaking population is not distributed evenly across the country. So it really centers in the capital city, where there's a sizable part of the population is actually ethnic Russians, and then the northeastern part of Estonia bordering Russia, where actually city of Narva, which is basically the border town, is majority Russian speaking. And this is something that has been a defining feature of Estonian politics for ever since the regaining of independence in 1991, and continues to this day. And obviously, as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine has deepened that divide, or sort of underlined this difference, and that is again something that we can probably talk more about if you're interested. And then the third.
Yes, I was surprised just that when you mentioned like what are the things that liberals are most concerned about, that the war in Ukraine did not pop up there.
This is the war in Ukraine is obviously something which is still relatively recent development. So it's been going on now for close to 1.5 years. But before that, this Estonian-Russian dimension has been relevant for a long time. It's been a defining feature of Estonian politics ever since the independence, like I said before. But just to conclude, the third one is something that could be sort of loosely defined as now this more of a traditional left-right on the socioeconomic axis dimension, where people lean on one hand they lean more towards the redistribution of income and providing more public services and things like that, and on the other hand stressing the economic freedoms, private responsibility, taking charge of your life, all of those things like you would expect from the left-right debate. Now with the war in Ukraine, then this was clearly something that the shock was felt throughout the Estonian society very clearly. It was very clearly felt in all Baltic states, in Latvia and Lithuania in particular. So Lithuanians, I just visited the country last week, and they are, exceptionally belligerent. So they're staunchly supporting Ukraine, which is also true in Estonia. However, in Estonia, this is the thing that makes where this the ethnic Russian minority becomes important, because a sizable part of that minority, especially these people who are living in northeastern part of the country, have been traditionally following the Russian media. So they are Russian speaking, they watch Russian TV channels, they follow the Russian news and so on. And this obviously has a really important repercussions in taking into the account what's happening in Russia, together with the war effort. So that is something where Estonian politics, or Estonia, took a pretty hardline stance right after the war broke. So we tried to block many of the Russian propaganda channels and so on. But we live in the age of the internet, so it's not necessarily easy thing to do. But it is a problem if you have a part of the society who's already feeling sometimes resentful, feeling marginalized, and so on and so forth. We can argue if it's in which cases it's justified, in which cases probably not so. But if these people live in the media sphere of the aggressor country, then that is obviously a problem, and that causes a political problem.
There's a question I'd love to ask, and I'd love to ask it in two ways, both historically and currently. And I guess it's how relations with Russia have been a part of politics for Estonia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Obviously, I'm kind of thinking about, are there parties in Estonia that are traditionally seen as a little bit more friendly to Russia, and are there parties that are seen as a little bit more unfriendly to Russia? Has that been the case historically over the last several decades? And is it still the case now that there are some parties that are seen that way? Or has, with the invasion of Ukraine, has basically all of the parties turned into kind of, we're very much against Russia now?
Well, the short answer is of course that it's complicated. So first of all, if we talk about the time period ever since the 1991 when Estonia became independent, then it has really it's a story of shifting sands. So this is something where Russia hasn't remained the same throughout that time. When Estonia regained the independence, then we still had Mikhail Gorbachev. Then you had Boris Yeltsin as a president of Russia, which was a very different kind of Russia, of course, at that time. Both culturally, militarily, economically. So that was a very different time. However, now even with Putin, the trajectory of Russia has been not linear one. So this is something where initially, I still remember I was 20 when Estonia became independent again. So that's a long time, and I remember the times when there was an earnest discussion in Europe whether EU could one day accept Russia as a member, and there was lots of different ideas around, but things have clearly worked out differently. Now coming to the impact of the Russian war to the Estonian party politics, and whether there has been a political force that's been friendly to Russia, then we haven't had a separate political party which has been kind of clearly Russian party. This is something which is some people find it curious that if you have such a big part of the 20% of the population ethnic Russians, how come that they do not have a distinctive separate political representation? And the answer is that traditionally, the Russian-speaking ethnic minority has been voting for the Center Party, but they have never been, defining group within the supporters of Center Party. So Center Party traditionally had two big voter segments. So it's roughly half and half, though. So roughly half of their support came from the Russian-speaking population, where majority of Russian speakers actually used to vote for the Center Party. And the second half came from the elderly, from the pensioners, from retired people, mostly. And then there was a sprinkling of other groups. But basically, it was between these two. And so this is something which, to a large degree, remains the same now. However, one of the things that was very clearly visible in the data, as soon as the war in Ukraine broke, then clearly Center Party had a really difficult position, because they sort of had to take their position between two groups that were pulling in a very different direction. So I'm not saying that I'm not trying to imply that the Estonian Russian-speaking population is somehow, unified in their support towards the Russian war in Ukraine. That's definitely not true. However, they are clearly more measured in their attitudes and judgments, and there's different opinions within the Russian-speaking population, whilst the Estonian-speaking population is clearly really unified in terms of what they think, who's the aggressor, who's to blame, and what could be the likely outcome or just solution to the aggression in Ukraine. So this is something where Center Party found themselves between a rock and a hard place. So this was a really difficult position for them, and as a result, the Russian-speaking voters in Estonia sort of deflected, not just from Center Party, but at one point, more than 60% of Estonian Russian-speaking population identified in the weekly and monthly surveys that they do not have a political preference. They would vote for no party. It has come down now since that time, but it still remains higher than the baseline before the war in Ukraine. So I think we can safely conclude that one of the effects of the Ukrainian war in the Estonian politics has been the alienation of the Russian-speaking voter from the politics in general, not just from their traditional party of choice, Center Party.
How does the average Estonian feel about the threat from Russia towards them? For listeners who may not be aware, Estonia is a member of NATO. And so in that sense, it certainly seems like they're more protected than Ukraine was, but by a large degree. But despite the NATO protection and being a member of NATO, do Estonians, in kind of an everyday sense, feel like they are threatened by Russia, or is it less of an active threat and more just something that is on the horizon?
It's clearly in the back of the minds for people. So this is something that we have been also actually polling and asking. And when we posed that question it was actually exactly a year ago, May in 2022, where the Russian aggression was still very fresh, then it was clear that there was even though, like you said, Estonia is a member of NATO and all of this, there was a clear fear amongst the population that the conflict might escalate. Who knows what's happening in Ukraine, how bad things will turn, whether in the end NATO will in somehow directly get involved or get into the middle of things, and then what happens next, whether the war will spread, because we do live just less than 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border, where there's a full-scale war going on in Europe. So Now the year forward from this, again, if you ask people's opinions right now, then the answers tend to be that people generally do not feel threatened in a any immediate or physical sense of the word. However, this is something that our the head of the defense forces just gave a very solemn interview 4 or 5 weeks ago in the TV, where he stressed that he does not see any kind of a happy conclusion to the conflict in Ukraine, and it doesn't matter who wins, even if everything goes the way we would hope, then Ukraine will win and regain its territory and all of that, then Russia remains hostile. Russia remains dangerous for the countries in the region, in the the geopolitical point of view. So Russia has clearly defined their imperialist aspirations. So they have very different view of the past and the future of the European or Eurasian continent as they like to see it, and they seem to be pretty determined to follow it through, as the situation in Ukraine seems to testify. So I think this is. To summarize it shortly, people in Estonia tend to take this threat seriously, although they seem to think that this is not an immediate threat, or this is something where we would need to be worried or afraid the same way like people in Ukraine are. So we do appreciate and we do trust that the membership of NATO membership is something which is a really important part of the not only the Estonian security but the European security architecture. This is testified by Finland just a couple of weeks ago became a full member of NATO. Sweden is waiting for the outcome of Turkish election. Hopefully becomes a member as well once this gets sorted. So this is a regional issue, not just the Estonian one. So people do take Russian threats seriously in our neck of the woods.
To switch over to something that's a little more positive and not necessarily about all of Europe, but just about Estonia, one of the things that I find very interesting about Estonia is that it has a reputation for really good governance, maybe the last 2 weeks aside. But Estonia has a reputation for being technologically savvy and having really efficient government services that are, there's this ideal of the e-government and that it's easy to deal with. And I will be very honest, I don't know a lot of details about this, but I know that impression exists in Western Europe and in America, that Estonia seems to be pretty well run. Could you talk about that a little bit? Number one, do you think that perception is true? Is that deserved? And number two, I guess, what are those interesting things that Estonia has been able to accomplish, if you think it is true?
Yeah, I do think that there's definitely a kernel of truth in this. I must say that my personal feeling is that we have been, slightly falling behind lately. Not going quite as quickly and as fast as we could have over the last few years at least. But the backdrop for this is again that Estonia has been in a way, we have been a lottery winners in a number of different ways. So one of the things which I think has been an enabling feature is that it's a really small and in many ways close-knit society. So we have only about 1.2 million people. This is something which is relatively easy to organize, easy to govern compared to a country like US or China or Germany for that matter. So the scale is one of the enabling features. Then there have been a couple of things that have just gone our way, so to say. Like you said, the population is relatively technically savvy. This is something that has, again, many different probable reasons. One of those is that again, it's hard to say which is the horse and which one is the carriage. But Estonia became in a way famous for as being the birthplace of Skype. So this was it was actually funded by Swedish guy, a couple of Swedish guys of the Kazaa fame, the original file sharing platform. So once they ventured into the voice over internet business, then we had 4 Estonian engineers who were instrumental in setting it up from the technical side, and the rest is as they say, history. One of the things that this led to was that Estonia had a first round of, so to say, internet millionaires who then managed to create this kind of a virtuous circle. So lots of ex-Skype people went out and established their own next startups and so on and so forth. So we have the highest proportion or highest number of unicorns. The startup firms valued north of $1 billion. Per capita in Europe, definitely. I'm hesitant saying in the world, but definitely in Europe. Then we were lucky to have a couple of people with clear vision and willingness to push things through in 90s in terms of the public digital infrastructure. And again, that is something where we had an unexpected benefit of coming from a relatively technically backward environment of the Soviet Union, where we didn't have. I used to work in the banking at that time, and I remember that when we went to Finland to see how the banking is done in a way in mid 90s, then they had those big, extensive, hugely expensive computer systems that they had just invested in like 5 or 10 years ago, but which were technically becoming very quickly obsolete. So they in a way, we had a advantage of starting later, so we could leapfrog over all of those cumbersome first experiments in digitalization and start from the clean slate. Estonia was able to build up the system of private secure identification that became the basis of a large number of public services that are provided. So they all have central registries. And of course, in 90s, the big question was that we had computers around, but the question was that if you commit your health records to a central registry, then how sure can you be that they remain secure? And there's a way of keeping them secure is that you encrypt them within the same system and will not let them go out of that system. However, that would clearly and severely restrict the usefulness of that data. And Estonia was able to build up this digital secure infrastructure, which became the basis for the provision of a number of different services, from the pharmacy system where you can just walk into the pharmacy and get your prescriptions with your ID card wherever the doctor has prescribed them, to declaring taxes within something that Estonians are immensely proud of, that we can do our taxes literally in less than a minute on a iPhone or any other phone for that matter, or voting on the internet, which is something which has been a controversial issue throughout Europe and remains somewhat controversial in Estonia. But that's something that's been going on for many years. And this time, this election in March this year was the first time when more votes were given over the internet than on the paper. So that was another milestone.
We'll be coming up on time here soon, but before we go, I want to ask, what would you say as a liberal in Estonia, as someone who has founded a liberal political organization, what problems are liberals going to face in the next 4 or 5 years or the next 10 years that they're going to have to solve if Estonia is going to keep growing and succeeding?
That's a very good question, and I would again zoom it out for a moment and say that in my opinion, the most pressing issue is something which is again not just relevant for Estonia. This is something that is shared for, or should be shared for, the liberal forces throughout the Europe at least. And I would even expand it beyond the borders of Europe. So that is something that I'm actually working on myself on a daily basis, struggling with this issue and trying to find a solution. And if I try to put it shortly or give an outline of the issue, then this is something that is again very clearly visible from the data. But in general terms, the issue seems to be, for me, that the liberal forces in Estonia and elsewhere in Europe are facing a very particular kind of a coordination problem. And the problem is this, that if you look at the people's political opinions on the issues like, climate change, like immigration, like the same-sex marriages, like the EU sovereignty issues, all those things, then liberal parties, to a large degree, share very, if not the same, then at least very kind of a similar voter base. So they draw from the same set of people who have, so to say, different kind of brand preferences in terms of their actual political party preference. The situation is, however, very different if you look at the far right, where the far right is not internally split. For the voters of far right, be they voters of AFD in Germany or the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, Perussuomalaiset or True Finns in Finland, whichever country, UKIP in UK, for the voters of those parties, their party of choice is the only game in town. So they are not really considering anyone else. And now this is something which has a really important and interesting implications for not only for running campaigns, but also for governance, for governing. So how can you counter that raise of far right and raise of the populism and raise of the illiberal democracy like you would have in Hungary under Viktor Orban? So how can you withstand that pressure? How can you reverse that pressure? And this is why I think our liberal landslide was actually pretty important one, not only in Estonian terms, but also in broader European terms. So how can you build this sort of a common ground and platform for the liberal forces so that they can withstand that tide, or turn that tide, I would rather say. And if you ask me that what is the most pressing issue, then that would be the one that I'd put my finger on.
All right. Well, we are coming up on time now, so I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we ask to everyone on this podcast. And that is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more about Estonia? Whether it's Estonian history or politics or the issues that are happening in Estonia right now, what would you recommend for them? A book, a blog, a Twitter account that would be good to follow, a news source, anything for people who want to learn more?
Well, the first thing that I would really recommend is come pay us a visit. So come over. So don't come in winter. This is miserable time, but
I would love to, by the way. I'm very much eager to go visit all of the Baltic states one day. I think it would be a wonderful trip.
Come in summer. So we have those northern short nights. So there's like full daylight throughout this is actually, lots of my American friends have trouble sleeping in summer because we only have like 4 hours of daylight or 4 hours of twilight in the middle of the night. But yeah, this is one of the first thing that I would recommend. Now, getting a bit of a broader view, then I'd say that in order to really understand this part of the world, then there are a few A few authors that I'd recommend. So Tony Judt is one of those who's now, unfortunately passed away. So he used to write really insightful things, British historian, about the history of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Timothy Garton has been writing insightful things about that region, not Estonia in particular, but the backdrop would be clearly very useful. In terms of Twitter accounts, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, our president before the previous one, has a very big following, and he's, when you asked before that whether there are any political forces that are, very much opposed to Russia, then it doesn't get much more opposed to Russia than his Twitter feed. So he's been the arch nemesis of Russia and Putin ever since he was still an active politician. From the other end, I would recommend, for instance, a good friend of mine, Sten Tamkivi, who's one of the leading lights of the Estonian startup community. So he has a really big following on Twitter. So that would be one of the things to keep an eye on. So he has an account by the name of Seikatsu. So we can probably drop them into the episode notes later. And then apart from this, I don't know. There are a few important books that I could recommend. So there's Jan Gross has written a few ones. He was one of Estonia's hopes for the Nobel Prize of Literature ever until the day he again unfortunately passed away without getting one. But yeah, I think once you have the broader, bigger view, then you'll eventually find there's specific things that would interest anyone in particular.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Tarmo Juristo. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks. It was great to be here.